Today we shall be discussing a very interesting topic, which is the Roman See. Now, what do we mean when we say the Roman See? This practically refers to the chair and the authority of the Pope in Rome. Okay, that's why it is called the Roman See. Nowadays, obviously, we all know that if the Pope gives an order, gives a regulation, all the churches, all the dioceses that are subject to Rome have to obey. Okay, therefore, if the Pope orders something, all the Catholic churches all over the world, since they consider the Pope as their leader, they have to obey. Now, this comes from the fact that the Pope is considered to be the successor of St. Peter. St. Peter, who was the first leader of the church, who was appointed by Christ. Okay, that is where the Pope gets his importance, his authority. But as we shall see, the Pope, even though he was always considered as a very important person, and his see, therefore the Diocese of Rome, always had some particular authority, it was not always the case that whatever the Pope said had to be obeyed by everyone. Okay, this is a development in Christian doctrine which took place mainly from the 4th and the 5th centuries. Okay, obviously there were also historical reasons which brought this about, namely the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, so till the 5th century, the late 5th century, the most important ruler in the West was the emperor. When Rome fell in the year 476, the most important ruler turned out to be the Pope, because the Pope also took over all the responsibilities of government, okay, because that's how history developed. And this also brought with it importance when it comes to church discipline and to, let's say, the establishment of Christian morality and Christian ethics. Okay, so this is what we shall be discussing in brief today. Now, we said that all this happens in the 4th and the 5th centuries, or rather, this starts in the 4th and the 5th centuries. Why this is so? This is so because in the 4th and 5th centuries, these 2 centuries were the epoch of the self-conscious emergence of the great patriarchates. Now, what do we mean by patriarchates? A patriarchate is a very important diocese, like, for example, Rome. Okay, a patriarchate would have a number of subservient dioceses. Just to bring you a very simple example, for example, Malta has a subservient diocese, which is Gozo. Gozo is, let's say, subsidiary to Malta, but Malta then is subsidiary to Rome. Okay, now in the past, in the 4th and 5th centuries, there were 5 of these important patriarchates, and the patriarch of each of these dioceses, of these patriarchates, were considered to be equal. Okay, so we can say we had kind of 5 popes. Okay, and then we'll see what happened to the other 4. All right, now these patriarchates were 5 in the 4th and 5th centuries. The first 3, the most important 3, were recognized in the Council of Nicaea, which took place in the year 325, therefore at the beginning of the 4th century. In the Council of Nicaea, it was established that the most important 3 were Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. Okay, these were the 3 most important Christian centers in the world at the time. Okay, Christian centers, of course, which had important leaders, because there were important Christian centers even in Africa, for example, but they did not have a leader which had such an important influence on the church. Okay, but these 3, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, were the most important. And their positions, kind of which of these is the most important and which is the least important, was also established in the Council of Nicaea. Rome obviously was the most important. The second most important was Antioch, the reason being because when St. Peter left Jerusalem, he founded a Christian community in Antioch. Therefore, the first Christian community outside of the Holy Land was in Antioch. And Antioch was also, let's say, the nest where a number of very important early theologians emerged. Okay, like, for example, St. Ignatius of Antioch, who is, let's say, the first historical Christian author whom we know by name, of whom we have some writings, and who certainly existed. Okay, St. Ignatius of Antioch, who lived in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. He is said to have been a disciple of St. John. And after these, there was the Patriarchate of Alexandria. Alexandria, which was a very important Christian city because of the number of great teachers who came from there. So, their importance was established in the Council of Nicaea. Eventually, by the end of the 4th century and beginning of the 5th century, two new important patriarchates were established, and these were Constantinople and Jerusalem. Okay, Constantinople, obviously, because it became the second Rome. Okay, therefore, the Patriarch of Constantinople had to be a very important Christian authority as well, because he was, let's say, the bishop of the second most important city in the empire, and also Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, let's say, had been destroyed in the 1st century, and it was re-established by Constantine in the 4th century. Eventually, in the late 4th century, bishops like, for example, Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, who we have mentioned in other lectures when we discussed the sacraments, worked a lot in order to give Jerusalem this important status, the status of one of the 5 most important patriarchates. Obviously, one of the, let's say, the things that helped Jerusalem to get this status was, since Jerusalem was the city where Christ lived and died. Okay, and obviously where the church was founded, where Christ went up to heaven, where the Holy Spirit came, etc. So Jerusalem had these important points in order to make it become the one of the 5 most important cities in Christendom. Now, in the Council of Constantinople, which took place in the year 381, the Patriarchate of Constantinople was recognized and it was placed in 2nd place. Okay, therefore, before we had Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria, now we had Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. This was the order of their rank. And eventually, in the Council of Chalcedon in the year 451, therefore we are in the mid-5th century, the Patriarch of Jerusalem was recognized and it was placed in the 5th position. Okay, so Jerusalem was the most important after Alexandria. These 5 were known as the Pentarchy. Now, penta in 5 in Greek means 5. Okay, so the 5 patriarchates, the Pentarchy. And we can say that these were practically the ruling body of the universal church. Okay, therefore, till the 5th century, we can safely say that the church, rather than being led simply by the Pope in Rome, it was led by the 5 patriarchs or bishops of these 5 very important cities: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. Okay, so those were the ruling body of the universal church. Now, let us start by saying something about how the Roman See was viewed in the East. Okay, now in the East, everyone knew that in Rome there was a successor of St. Peter. Everyone recognized that and everyone accepted that. No one claimed, for example, that the Bishop of Constantinople was the successor of Peter. No, everyone agreed that the successor of Peter was found in Rome. But how did they consider this? How did they interpret it? What kind of importance did they give to the Pope in the East? So let's start by seeing this. Okay, now everywhere in the East, and no less than in the West, Rome enjoyed a special prestige, as it is indicated by the precedence accorded to it without any question. Okay, therefore, as we said, in Nicaea, which was a church council which took place in the East, Rome was immediately recognized as the most important patriarchate, as the most important bishop see. The only possible rival to Rome was the new and rapidly expanding city of Constantinople. And obviously, since the city was expanding and becoming ever more important, even the role of its bishop, of its patriarch, became more important. But the highest claim that the Second Ecumenical Council, therefore the Council of Constantinople, which was held in 381, could put in for Constantinople, was to the effect that the Bishop of Constantinople shall hold the first rank after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople is the new Rome. Therefore, if we see, let's say, the proceedings of the Council of Constantinople, where the importance of the sees is mentioned, Constantinople is never put at a par with Rome. Okay, it is the most important after Rome. Therefore, Rome was always considered as the most important see in Christendom, the most important, let's say, seat of a bishop. That is what we mean by when we say see. This, however, was ignored by the Patriarchate of Alexandria and was to be rejected eventually by the papal legates in Chalcedon in 451 and was declared null by Pope Leo I. Okay, so this is a bit of insight into church politics and church intricacies, we can say. Okay, so Constantinople considered itself to be as the most important after Rome. However, other older cities like Alexandria never accepted that Constantinople was more important than it. Okay, and as we said, eventually, even the Pope ordered that this title of second most important had to be removed. Okay, and this happened, as we said, by Pope Leo I in the Council of Chalcedon in the mid-5th century. Therefore, in the 5th century, we already have this new supremacy that was expected from the Pope. Okay, the Pope expected to be regarded as the most important, and no one was anywhere near to his authority. But that was in the mid-5th century. Okay, we have to see what happened before. Now, in this way, Rome's preeminence, therefore this importance of Rome, remained undisputed throughout the patristic period, therefore from the beginning till the 8th century. For evidence of it, one need only recall the leading position claimed as a matter of course by the Pope and freely conceded to them at the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon. What do we mean? The Pope was not present for these ecumenical councils, which took place in 431 in Ephesus and in 451 in Chalcedon. He sent his legates. But the legates of the Pope had, let's say, a very important role. These councils were considered to be as ecumenical councils because the legates of the Pope, the representatives of the Pope, on behalf of the Pope, accepted their proceedings. Okay, therefore, even if the Pope is not present, it is only when he accepted the proceedings that the councils were given the status of ecumenical councils, therefore councils which are binding to the whole church. And this already gives us some idea of the importance that the role of the Pope was being given even in the East in the 5th century. Remember, we are in the 5th century, which is quite late. We even find that the 5th century historians, like, for example, Socrates and Sozomen, who were two church historians, concluding on the basis of a misreading of the famous letter of Pope Julius I to the Eastern bishops, which was written in the year 340, protesting against the deposition of Athanasius and Marcellus, that it was unconstitutional for synods to be held without the Roman pontiff being invited, and for decisions to be taken without his concurrence. Okay, so this letter, which is most probably thwarted, you can say, but it gives us a very clear idea. In the 5th century, the Pope expected to be invited to all synods held by the Church. And even if he was not present, the decisions taken became active and mandatory only after he accepted them. Okay, so this is the situation in the 5th century. At the outbreak of a Christological controversy that took place in the 5th century because of some erroneous teachings which were kind of preached by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was called Nestorius, Both Nestorius and his rival, the Patriarch of Alexandria, who was called Cyril, hastened to bring their cases to Rome. Okay? The letter, therefore, Rome, declaring that the ancient custom of the churches constrained him to communicate matters of such weight to the Pope to seek his advice before acting. Okay? Therefore, these two important patriarchs of Constantinople and of Alexandria, when they disagreed on a theological issue, they spoke to the Pope. And the Bishop of Alexandria said that it was an ancient tradition to kind of bring their case to the Pope and see what the Pope says. In one of his sermons, Cyril of Alexandria goes so far as to salute the Pope of the time, who was Pope Celestine, as the Archbishop of the whole world. Okay, so in Alexandria, the bishop calls the Pope the Archbishop of the whole world. Now, did Cyril really mean what he wrote? We don't know. Probably he did not. Okay, but the fact that he uses expression shows that yes, in the mental imagination, rather, of the people, that was how the Pope was seen, the Archbishop of the whole world. The crucial question, however, is whether or not this undoubted primacy of honor was held to exist by divine right and so to involve an overriding jurisdiction. So far as the East is concerned, the answer must be, by and large, in the negative. Okay, so even though the Pope had some kind of primacy of honor, the Eastern bishops did not believe that the Pope had a divine right to rule over the whole church. They only used this piece of detail when it was useful to them, as Cyril did when he called him the Archbishop of the whole world. Okay, so even at the beginning of the 5th century, the universal authority of the Pope was still contested. Okay, now, while showing immense reverence to the Pope and setting great store by its pronouncements, the Eastern churches never treated Rome as the constitutional center and head of the church, much less as an infallible oracle of faith and morals, and on occasion had not the least scruple about resisting its express will. Okay, now what do we mean? Even though the Eastern bishops respected the Pope and considered him to be as the successor of Saint Peter, they did not consider the Pope to be infallible. And neither did they consider the Pope to be the head of the whole church. And whenever they disagreed with something that the Pope said, they had no problem with criticizing him. Now, if someone had to do that today, if a bishop had to openly criticize the Pope or go against one of his rulings, that bishop would most probably suffer some kind of consequence, like, for example, losing his see, if not also being, how can we say, censored, okay, being prohibited to speak on behalf of the church. Okay, so we are in a period where this doctrine was not yet established. The Pope was not considered by everyone to be the ruler of the whole church. It is instructive to notice their estimate of the Apostle Peter. So what did the Eastern bishops think of Peter? For it was the promises and charges which were made to Peter by Christ that were to provide the theological substructure of later papacy. Okay, so it was because of what Christ says to Peter that eventually the Pope expected to be treated as the most important leader in the church. But as far as the 5th century, the Eastern bishops had other ideas. Now, what did they think of St. Peter? On the one hand, St. Peter's position as the prince of the apostles was acknowledged without the smallest reservation. So everyone accepted that Peter was the prince of the apostles, the most important apostle. Didymus, who was a bishop in Alexandria, for example, calls St. Peter the Korypheus, which means the leader who had the chief rank among the apostles. The power of reconciling penitents was given to Peter directly, and only through Peter to the other apostles. Okay, so all the authority that the apostles had came to them through Peter. St. John Chrysostom describes Peter as the Korypheus of the choir, the mouthpiece of the apostolic company, the head of the band, the leader of the whole world, the foundation of the church, the ardent lover of Christ. Okay, so St. John Chrysostom gives all these beautiful titles to St. Peter. Later writers, like for example, St. Cyril of Alexandria, whom we have already mentioned, and also another author who came from Antioch, Theodoret, reflect the same point of view in almost identical language. Okay, therefore, all of these considered Peter to be the most important apostle without any hesitation. In harmony with this one school of interpretation equated the rock mentioned in the Gospel of St. Luke 16:18 with the actual person of St. Peter. Okay, so when Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church," this school of thought considered that rock to be literally the person of St. Peter. He is the one on whom the whole church is built. Cyril said that Simon was named Peter because Jesus Christ proposed to found his church upon him. Peter in Greek is Petros, and Petros also in Greek means rock. Okay, so they use, let's say, this play in words. Other authors like Epiphanius of Salamis and Maximus the Confessor can be cited as witnesses to the same interpretation of this text, okay, that Peter is literally the rock on whom the church is built. On the other hand, there is no suggestion in the Greek fathers that St. Peter's position as leader carried with it any status different in kind from that of the other apostles. Okay, so even though they considered Peter as the foundation of the church, they did not consider Peter to have a different status from the other apostles. Yes, he was the most important among them, but he did not have anything special. He did not have any special treatment or anything of the sort. The current exegesis of the texts related to St. Peter, on the whole, ran strongly counter to such an inference. Cyril of Alexandria, for example, is equally ready to refer the rock of Matthew 16:18 to Christ himself, as apprehended by faith, while Epiphanius, St. John Chrysostom, and Theodoret see the rock as the symbol not of Peter, but of Peter's faith. Okay, so it is the faith of St. Peter on which the church is built, not on Peter himself. The order that Christ gives to Peter, "Feed my sheep," which is found in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 21, so far from being taken as indicating any special authority or rank, denotes, for St. Cyril, no more than the formal confirmation of his pastoral functions as apostle after his denial of the Lord. Okay? So when Jesus tells Peter, "Feed my sheep," he is not giving him any special authority, because feeding the sheep, tending the sheep, was the responsibility of all the apostles, not only of St. Peter. But Cyril tells us this detail is presented in the Gospel because since Peter had denied Christ, Christ wanted kind of to re-establish him. Okay? But it does not, according to him, indicate any special authority or rank, because as we said, feeding the sheep was the responsibility of all the apostles, not only of St. Peter. Similarly, the admonition to strengthen his brethren, because in the Gospel of St. Luke, we find Jesus telling Peter, "Strengthen your brethren," is usually interpreted as simply illustrating a general truth of God's dealings with man, meaning that the restoration after sin is possible on condition of repentance. Okay, therefore, strengthening your brethren means forgive their sins in order to make them once again strong to be good Christians. What is perhaps more significant, there are only very, very occasional hints that St. Peter's authority was mystically transmitted to and as a result present in his successors in the Roman See. Okay, so while the bishops of the East did give some kind of authority to Peter, that did not mean that his authority was transmitted to his successors. We find this only very, very, very rarely. Okay. For example, one of the occasions when this kind of authority of Peter was in some way envisaged in one of his successors was during the Council of Chalcedon, when Chalcedon is found in the East, when the letter of Leo was read, consisting of an explanation of the status of Christ. Okay, then in that occasion, and practically only in that occasion, the Eastern bishops started to shout, Peter has spoken through Leo. Okay, so it was as if Saint Leo became the mouthpiece of Saint Peter. This is one of the only occasions when the Eastern bishops give the same authority of Saint Peter to the Pope in Rome. But as we said, this was just one occasion, and there couldn't have been too many of them, because otherwise it would have found some kind of writings attesting to this. Okay, so by and large, the Eastern bishops did not consider the Pope to have the same authority as St. Peter, while saying also that not all of them agreed that Peter had any special authority vis-à-vis the other apostles. As I said, he was the most important, yes, but it did not give him any special rank or anything. Okay? Now, that was roughly how the East looked to the Pope. Now let's see what the West thought. Okay? By the middle of the 5th century, the Roman Church had established de jure as well as de facto, therefore in theory and also in practice, a position of primacy in the West. And the papal claims to supremacy over all the bishops of Christendom had been formulated in precise terms. Okay, so by the 5th century, in the West at least, yes, the Pope was considered to be the leader of the whole Church. Here, we need only remark that strictly theological factors apart, the position of Rome as the revered ancient capital and the sole apostolic see of the West, the all-embracing influence it exercised liturgically and theologically in the Western Empire, and the special role the popes were called upon to fulfill in the era of barbarian invasions, all contributed to this development. Okay, so as we said, if we put aside the theological authority of the Pope, there are these historical factors which help the Pope. Okay? In the West, we don't have any other see which was founded by an apostle. It was only Rome that was founded by one of the 12. Malta was not founded by one of the 12 apostles, okay? Because St. Paul was not one of the 12 apostles, so be careful, all right? Apart from that, as we said, the Pope had a very important leadership role, political leadership role after the fall of the empire, because he was the one who defended in some way Rome and the empire from the barbarians, and also because the liturgy of Rome became the model of the liturgies of other countries. Okay, so all these purely historical factors helped for the increase of the importance of the authority of the Pope in Rome. Tracing the history of the times, particularly of the various Christological controversies that took place in the 4th and the 5th centuries, one cannot fail to be impressed by the skill and persistence with which the Holy See was continually advancing and consolidating its claims. Now there we have In the brackets, you see 4 examples of controversies that took place in the 4th and 5th centuries. We have Arianism and Nestorianism, which dealt with Christological doctrines. And then we had also church issues, ecclesial issues like Donatism and Pelagianism, which resulted in schisms. Okay, therefore, groups which broke union with the church because they considered the church to be too lax. Okay, as we said in previous lectures. Now, the position of the Roman See in these cases was always taken into a lot into consideration with a lot of importance. Okay, as we said, when it comes to Arianism and Nestorianism, these were dealt with councils which took place in the East, but they became mandatory only after the Pope accepted the proceedings. And likewise, when it comes to Donatism and Pelagianism, which were ecclesial schisms which took place then in the West, in Africa, and also in Europe. Okay, so these were considered to be as schismatic groups once the Pope said these no longer form part of the Universal Church because they are breaking communion with the Church. Therefore, the Holy See, therefore the Roman See, was always becoming more important, always kind of asserting its position when it comes to moral and theological issues. Since the occupant of the Roman See was accepted by everyone to be the successor of St. Peter, it was easy to draw the inference that the unique authority which Rome in fact enjoyed and which the popes saw concentrated in their persons and in their office was no more than the fulfillment of divine plan. Therefore, the Pope believed that their importance and their supremacy was part of God's plan. Okay? Our concern here lies with the function of the Roman primacy in the theology of the Church. Okay, so when it comes to doctrine, when it comes to catechism, how much importance was given to the word of the Pope? And now we shall see a number of authors and see what they say, a number of very important authors who lived in the 4th and the 5th centuries, and all coming from the West. The first one is Hilary of Poitiers. Hilary of Poitiers lived in the 4th century when he was bishop in France. There is little to be gleaned on the subject from Hilary. Okay, so Hilary does not say much about it. He agrees that St. Peter was the first to believe. He was the captain of the apostolic group. He is the foundation upon which the church was built, and he is the custodian of the celestial gates. Okay, but he does not appear to connect these facts with the contemporary Roman pontiff. Okay, so while Hilary gives all the importance to St. Peter, nowhere does he say that the Pope has those same authorities, those same titles. St. Ambrose of Milan presents a much fuller teaching, and there can be no doubt of the extraordinary veneration in which he held the Roman Church. Okay, therefore he saw the Roman Church as really a see to be venerated. From the earliest times, according to Ambrose, the Roman Church had been the unswerving exponent of the Church's creed in its integrity and purity. Okay, so Ambrose says, if we have to see where the pure faith lies, we have to look at Rome. Okay, and this is a very important attestation. He said that to be in communion with Rome was a guarantee of correct belief. Therefore, if someone is not in union with Rome, therefore he is not believing Christianity in the proper way. Hence, he advises that matters touching on faith and order and the mutual relations of Orthodox churches should be referred for settlement to the Roman pontiff. Okay, therefore, the Roman pontiff, according to him, had to be, let's say, the referee when it comes to all church issues. Yet, this is a very important yet, he nowhere recognizes the Roman pontiff as the final interpreter of the laws of ecclesial discipline, much less ascribes supreme jurisdiction over the church to him. Okay, so yes, the Pope has to be informed about everything. but it doesn't mean that the Pope has the last word. Okay, so Ambrose, on this, he is very ambivalent. He gives Rome due importance, but he says it does not mean that Rome has the last word. Rome has to be aware of all that is going on, but that's it. It is clear that Ambrose's interpretation of the texts found in the Gospel relating to St. Peter, which were simply to supply that jurisdiction with its theological substructure, was inconsistent, and in any case fell short of identifying the apostle with later popes. Okay, so Ambrose makes it clear, if we interpret these texts, nowhere do we find that what Jesus is telling Peter has to be attributed to the others, to the ones who came after him. Okay, so he is very clear. The text, the evangelical texts, are not enough to give the present Pope the same authority as St. Peter. If, for example, he sometimes interprets the Gospel of St. Matthew chapter 16:18, where Jesus says to Peter, "You are the rock on which I will build the church," when he interprets that as implying that the church was erected upon St. Peter, even adding that where Peter is, there is the church, his fuller discussion of the text suggests that the rock mentioned in that text is not the apostle's person, but rather his faith in Christ's leadership, in Christ's messiahship, and in his divinity, or his faith in the Savior himself, who is the object of all Christian faith. Okay, therefore, for Ambrose, the rock about which Jesus is speaking does not refer always to St. Peter, but rather to St. Peter's faith, or rather to Jesus himself, who is the foundation of faith. Similarly, while sometimes attributing special authority over the church to St. Peter himself, he also states that the gift of the keys, Jesus tells Peter, "I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven," the gift of the keys was not bestowed on Peter personally or exclusively, but it was bestowed on him as the representative of the apostles and all the Catholic bishops descending from them. Okay, so when Jesus gives Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, he is in actual fact giving them to all the apostles, according to St. Ambrose, and therefore, since he gave them to all the apostles, he gave them to all the bishops, because all the bishops are descendants of the apostles. Okay, so in this case, Peter is only a representative. It is not only he who holds the keys of the kingdom of heaven, but he is a representative of all the apostles and therefore all the bishops. Put in very simple words, what Ambrose is saying is that when it comes to leadership, when it comes to authority, when it comes to dignity, all bishops are equal. Okay, therefore he himself was saying that he was no less important than the Pope in Rome. Okay? That was the situation in Europe. Okay? We have Hilary and Ambrose. Hilary, who does not connect the rank of St. Peter to his successors, and neither does Ambrose. Okay, Ambrose gives importance to Peter, but he says his successor is not necessarily infallible. Now, another very important Christian center was North Africa. Okay, North Africa, remember that important theologians such as St. Augustine came from North Africa. Now, what do the North Africans say? In Africa, meanwhile, the prevailing doctrine was an extension of St. Cyprian's, which we discussed some lectures ago, okay, when we discussed the question of the unity of the church, etc. Okay, we did mention St. Cyprian. And Cyprian is the first theologian, whom we had said, who did not live in Italy, who gave some kind of supremacy to Peter. Okay, if we read the treatise of St. Cyprian, the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, is given by Cyprian supreme authority. Okay, but it is time to see what he meant by supreme authority. An important author who lived in the 4th, 5th centuries was Optatus of Milevum. Okay, now Optatus, in his controversy with the Donatists viewed the chair of St. Peter as one of the indispensable possessions of the true church. By this, he seems to have meant, as indeed he proceeds to explain, that the episcopal commission was first and uniquely conferred upon St. Peter, and that the other apostles and their successors participate equally in the self-same commission. Okay, so Peter was the first bishop. Those who became bishops after him share his same commission. They have therefore the same mission as Peter. In this way, the possibility of there being several chairs with the disunity which would inevitably result was effectively ruled out. Okay, so everyone was connected to Peter. Everyone had the same mission, but Peter was the one who represented everyone. For Optatus, therefore, communion with the See of Peter, therefore with Rome, was a vital necessity, although we would note that he laid almost equal stress on the desirability of communion with the Oriental churches and what he called the Septiformis Ecclesiae Asiae. Okay, now what does the Septiformis Ecclesiae Asiae mean? In the book of the Revelation of Apocalypse, we read about the 7 churches of Asia, the 7 churches in the region of Turkey, etc. Okay, and he is referring to these. So while Optatus does say that communion with Peter, with the chair of Peter, with Rome, is vital, he insisted also on communion with the Eastern churches. So what importance does Rome really have? Okay, if he insists equally on communion with the other churches, it seems that yes, it is important, but not that important. Okay, I mean, being united with Rome and being, let's say, at war with the other Oriental churches is not good. Okay, that is what he is saying. And now we come to Augustine and we see what Augustine says. Augustine's attitude was not different from this. Following Saint Cyprian, Augustine regarded Saint Peter as the representative or the symbol of unity of the Church and of the Apostolic College, and also the apostle upon whom the primacy was bestowed. Okay, so Augustine is very clear that Peter had primacy, therefore authority, over the other apostles. Even so, according to Augustine, Peter was a type of the church as a whole, meaning he represented the whole church. Thus, the Roman Church, the seat of St. Peter, to whom the Lord, after his resurrection, entrusted the feeding of his sheep, was, for St. Augustine, the church in which the primacy of the apostolic chair has ever flourished. Okay, therefore, the primacy of the most important chair of the apostle was always in Rome, according to Augustine. Augustine was involved towards the end of his life, in a very important controversy, which was the controversy against Pelagius, okay, what we call Pelagianism. And he wrote a number of texts against the Pelagians, and this gives us some insight on how he interpreted the role of the Pope. The 3 letters relating to Pelagianism, which the African Church sent to Pope Innocent in the year 416, and of which Augustine was the draftsman, therefore he was the one who drafted the letters, these suggest that he, Augustine, therefore, attributed to the Pope a pastoral and teaching authority extending over the whole Church, and found a basis for it in Scripture. Okay, now, saying that the Pope has pastoral and teaching authority over the whole Church does not mean that the Pope has disciplinary authority over the whole Church. For Augustine, this is what the Pope had. He had a pastoral and a teaching authority over all the churches, but it stopped there. At the same time, there is no evidence that he was prepared to ascribe to the Bishop of Rome, in his capacity as successor of St. Peter, a sovereign and inevitable doctrinal magisterium. Okay, so Augustine said, simply because the Pope is the successor of Peter does not mean that his magisterium, therefore his orders, are sovereign over all the church, and neither does it mean that he is infallible. For example, when in his controversy with Julian of Eclanum, another Pelagian, Augustine appealed to Innocent, to the Pope, since he believed that the Pope was only the mouthpiece of the truths which the Roman Church had held from ancient times in harmony with the Catholic churches. So this was the only reason why he appealed to the Pope, not because he wanted confirmation of what he believed, but rather because he believed that the Pope was the mouthpiece of truth. Nor was Augustine willing in practical matters to surrender one jot of the disciplinary independence of the African Church, which Cyprian had defended so strongly in his day. So when it came to discipline, Augustine did not accept the supremacy of the Pope. He said, in the disciplinary affairs of the Church of Africa, the Pope does not interfere. The truth is that the doctrine of the Roman primacy played only a minor role in Augustine's ecclesiology, as also in his personal religious thinking. So yes, he did respect the Pope. He believed that the Pope had a pastoral authority over all the church, that his teaching was in some way extended over all the church, but he was neither infallible and neither was he sovereign. Okay, his word was not to be considered as the last word in every diocese. So the question comes by, how come nowadays we believe that the Pope is sovereign over all the church? Why is it that when the Pope says something, everyone has to obey? When we see that such important authors, like even St. Augustine, for example, did not consider this to be the case in their day. Who were the people who worked to build this, how can we say, theory of the primacy of the popes? The answer is the popes themselves. Okay, the real framers and promoters of the theory of the Roman primacy were the popes themselves. Popes like Damasus, like Siricius, like Innocent, and their successors not only strove to advance on the practical plane this supremacy, but they sketched out the theology on which it was based, meaning that the doctrine, that the unique position and authority assigned by Christ to Saint Peter belonged equally to the popes who followed him as Bishop of Rome. Okay, so it was the work of these three who all lived in the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th century between 366 and 417. It was thanks to these that the theology of the primacy of the Roman See came by. Okay, it was they who kind of presented reasons why what Christ gave to Peter became also the possession of his successors. Okay, it was they who set the foundation. Leo the Great, who was Pope between 440 and 461, was responsible for gathering together and giving final shape to the various elements composing this thesis. Okay, so this doctrine reached its fulfillment in the person of Leo. His conception of the primacy is admirably set out in the letter which he sent to the Bishop of Thessalonica, Anastasius, and this was written in the year 446. And this is what he says: bishops indeed have a common dignity, but they do not have a uniform rank, inasmuch as even among the blessed apostles, notwithstanding the similarity of their honorable estate, there was a certain distinction of power. Okay, so Leo starts by acknowledging, yes, that all the bishops have the same dignity. They have the same holy orders. However, there are bishops who are more important than others, just as we see, even among the 12 apostles, that some were more important than others. For example, we know that on special occasions, Jesus used to take 3 of his apostles with him, Peter, James, and John. So that already shows that those 3 were in the eyes of Christ more important than the other 9. Among those 3, it was only with Peter that Jesus had a very special friendship. Okay, therefore Peter was more important even than these 2. And this is what Leo here is saying. While the election of all of them was equal, because all of them were chosen directly by Christ, yet it was given to one, that is to St. Peter, to take the lead of the rest. Jesus chose only one to be the leader of the apostles, and that was St. Peter. From this model has arisen a distinction of bishops also, and by an important ordinance, it has been provided that everyone should not arrogate anything to himself, but that there should be in each province one whose opinion should have precedence among the brethren, and again that certain whose appointment is in the greater cities should undertake a fuller responsibility, and that through them the care of the universal church should converge towards St. Peter's one chair, and nothing anywhere should be separate from its head. Okay, so he is saying here, in simple words, that all the apostles were chosen by Christ, but Christ chose one of them to be the leader. And therefore, since even Christ himself put a distinction between the role of bishop of the apostles, likewise, there is a distinction in the roles of bishops. Bishops of important cities have major responsibilities than bishops coming from small cities, and therefore, since they have major responsibilities, they have major authority. And among these bishops who have major authority, there is one who is the most important of all, the one who represents St. Peter, therefore the Pope. So all the cities kind of converge on the chair of Peter. All the bishops find their unity, find their fulfillment, as long as they are united to the chair of St. Peter in Rome. And whoever is separated from the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, it is as if he is a member of a body and he is detaching himself from the body, from the head. Okay? So this is how he presents it. So Leo puts into writing in very clear language why the Pope has to be considered as the most important bishop, and therefore the leader of the bishops, and therefore what he says is regulation for all the bishops. The teaching of St. Leo can be expounded in many of his writings, okay? And it involves the following ideas. First, the famous gospel texts referring to St. Peter should be taken to imply that supreme authority was conferred by our Lord upon the apostle. Okay, so whereas the other, especially the Eastern bishops, said the texts given to St. Peter, the text relating to St. Peter does not show that Peter had more authority than the apostles. It simply means that he represented them. Leo said no. These show that he had supremacy over the other apostles. Secondly, St. Peter was in actual fact the Bishop of Rome, and his magisterium was perpetuated in his successors in that see. Okay, so since Peter was really the Bishop of Rome, all the authority that he had was handed down to his successors. Thirdly, St. Peter, being in this way mystically present in the Roman see, therefore the Pope is kind of a reincarnation of St. Peter, the authority of the other bishops throughout Christendom does not derive immediately from Christ, but, as in the case of the apostles, it is mediated to them through St. Peter, therefore through the Roman pontiff, who in this way represents him, or to be more precise, is a kind of Petrus redivivus, Peter reincarnated. Okay, so Leo here is using a very serious argument. Okay, he is saying, in the person of the Pope, Peter is revived. Therefore, just as the other apostles got their authority from Christ through Peter, even today, all the bishops of the world get their authority from Christ through the person of the Pope. Therefore, if a bishop is not united to the Pope, he does not form part of the Church. Okay, because he has gotten his authority from somewhere else, not from Christ, because Christ gives the authority of the bishops only through St. Peter. Fourthly, and lastly, while the mandate of the other bishops is, of course, limited to their own diocese, for example, Archbishop Scicluna cannot give orders in the diocese of, of North Africa. His rulings are limited only to Malta and to any diocese which fall below Malta, like, for example, Gozo. Okay? So while the mandate of the other bishops is limited to their own diocese, St. Peter's magisterium, therefore his teaching, and with it that of his successors, underline his successors, who are the popes of Rome and no one else, is a plenitudo potestatis, okay, what he calls a complete authority extending over the entire church, so that its government rests ultimately with them, and they are its divinely appointed mouthpiece. Okay, so whereas the bishop of a diocese has only authority on his diocese, the Bishop of Rome has authority over all the world, okay? Because the government of the other dioceses are linked to the Catholic Church only if they are linked to St. Peter, therefore to the Pope. And the Pope is the mouthpiece of Christ. Therefore, anyone who is not linked to Rome does not form part of the true Church. And so, as we have seen, what happened in Rome more than other places in the 5th century, we are here, as we said, between 440 and 461, during the reign of Pope St. Leo, it is that which eventually set in stone the authority of the Pope. As we said, Leo lived at a time when the Roman Empire was falling to bits. Okay, the emperor had already left Rome, who was living in Ravenna, and therefore the city of Rome, which was always considered as the most important city in the world, was under the jurisdiction of the Pope. And so the Pope had this kind of influence on the people and also on the theology of the time. What happened in later centuries with the rise of Islam, all the other important sees, therefore, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem ceased to exist. Okay, they became Muslim cities, and therefore the authority of the patriarchates disappeared. So any Christians who remained either chose to follow the Pope, who was the most prominent person in the West, or else they chose to follow the Patriarch of Constantinople. But the Patriarch of Constantinople was very clearly subject to the Emperor of Constantinople, and Constantinople, after a few centuries, remained only a small city, Istanbul. Okay, therefore there was no universal authority, and as we said, the Patriarch was also always subject to the Empire and to the Emperor. So the most important prominent Christian leader turned out to be only the Pope, okay, because even North Africa eventually fell to Muslim rule. Okay, so this is how the Pope, first, this theology was formed by St. Leo, giving reasons why the Pope should be considered as the leader of the whole world. Eventually, as history turned out, what Leo said was put into practice very easily because Rome remained the only important city of the ancient Pentarchy, okay, because all the others practically either disappeared or else were reduced to a very small city-state which was subject to the emperor. So this is how nowadays we can speak of the Pope as the ruler of the whole world, and when the Pope says something, everyone has to obey. It all started in the 4th and in the 5th centuries. Thank you.